All right, Josh, thanks a lot for being here. Sunday Rewind.
Sure.
We're going to be doing, I forgot the title again.
It's Why on Earth Am I Here?
Why on Earth
is
Am
the
I Here?
title of the series. And then yesterday's message was living with purpose.
Living with Purpose. That's the
Yeah.
one. Okay, yes.
Or sorry, a life of purpose.
A Life of Purpose. Okay. Now, my voice sounds deeper, so I'm trying to be sexy, though.
Dude,
my wife says it sounds sexy. Like,
Yeah, well,
I'll go with it.
just
getting over a cold.
I'll just leave it at that, man.
All right, yeah.
I'll leave it between you two.
So yeah, but dude, yesterday was amazing. In all honesty, it hit me kind of hard because I was like, oh, I think I'm gonna stay home. I was kind of monitoring my cough. It stopped, and I was like, well, I don't want to get anybody sick, but thank God, I think it's over. It's just getting a little head rush here.
Yeah.
But it was such a blessing. We had a lot of people that showed, and I know that you already shared this, that we have one of our highest records.
Yeah,
right?
it was our new record attendance was last Sunday.
How many?
358.
That's amazing.
It's amazing. I mean, for a
Wow.
little church, that's a high number.
Dude, for any church having a high record, I mean that's awesome because
Yeah.
people could be anywhere else on Sunday, but they choose to be here,
Yeah.
and that's a beautiful thing to see.
Well, and it's crazy that that was our highest attendance of the last 5 years, and our second highest was 2 Sundays ago, which was 337. So were 337, 336, 358.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
exciting.
The Lord's moving.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, yesterday was a great message, and that was there are key things that I want to go over, but the core thing is like, why am I here? Why are we here? Why is anyone here? What's our purpose, right? One of the things he said was, what does God want from me? And then you followed up with a thing that I think kind of maybe shocked a couple people where you said, it's not about you, right? So being, a lot of people, we all see each other as the main character. We say, well, you know what, Josh, I hear you. You're very close to God. You're always in the Bible. What about the average person that enjoys the Bible, is getting to get to the relationship with the Lord, and then they hear something, oh, it's not about you. And if it's not about them, which it's hard sometimes to like fathom that, because in anything we have to be like, hey, yeah, I'm here, let me see what I can do. So we always take that role. But now you're saying, hey, it's not about you. Then who is it about then?
Yeah, well, it's not our story. We're not the main character in our story. God is the author. He's the director. He's the main character. He's the whole thing, and we're the extra in the background who's
supporting cast,
who's sipping coffee. But we get it mixed up, and I think it's normal because we have that tendency. It's the original sin. It's Adam and Eve. When they make that original decision of who am I going to follow? Am I going to follow my own plan for myself, or am I going to follow God's plan? And so I think it's very common. I think it's something that we all struggle with on a daily basis, this assumption that God is here for me. The Bible is written for me. I pray because I want God to do my will. And the reality is that it's very counterintuitive, but that's it. That's a recipe for a life of an underdeveloped potential, because you're limited by your own concepts of what you want for yourself. And the thing is that we didn't create ourselves. So we don't know what we're good at. We don't know why we were created. So that's why we have to go to the Creator. He created us. So we need to ask Him what His purpose is for us, not ask ourselves what our purpose is for ourselves. And it's counterintuitive because that's the original sin. We want to be God, and so that's kind of the premise of the whole series, is that we'll be able to discover. So then step one is just that, knowing that the invitation that Christ gives us is that we will find happiness and fulfillment, not by seeking happiness and fulfillment. We will find happiness and fulfillment by trying to satisfy the needs of our neighbor.
So you said something interesting there. So the first part was that it's not about us, and most of us here will be like, I agree with you, Josh. So then we have to have what you said yesterday, a purpose, a driven purpose. right? That driven purpose, how would you describe that as a Christian? What's our driven purpose then? Now, is it one driven purpose, or do we all facilitate a common purpose?
Yeah. So it's the same underlying purpose. It manifests itself in different ways, but the underlying one is love. It's what Jesus talks about over and over and over and over again. And love for love to be love, it can't be about you. It's about your neighbor. You know.
How do you shift focus? Because that's another thing you said. Hey, we have to shift focus. How do we do that? How does someone that has always, well, see, and I get that. You have people that are coming to Christ and they're saying like, I love Jesus. I love this guy because, something happened to me, right? So they're starting to shift their purpose. They're starting, or their focus, right? But now we have a part where it says, how do I get away from myself being the main character and start pushing towards Jesus being the main focus in my life?
Yeah.
What if everybody's going to have a different remedy towards that? But what would you say will be your first step?
I don't know if it's a first step, but it's definitely a step, and it might be a big step. And it's this: it's understanding what it means to love God. You see, because loving God, many times we think it's about, oh, I love God so much. Look, my gosh, I feel all this love in my heart for God, and you worship God and you pray, and there's this sensation of love that goes toward God. Like many people think that is love, that is loving God. And so when the expert in the law comes to Jesus and basically asks him the question of the purpose of life,
This is Matthew 27 or 22, 37.
He's asking Jesus, like, what's the main thing? What is the one commandment that is the most important one? And he says, well, actually, it's two. It's love the Lord your God over everything, and then love your neighbor as yourself. And so I grew up believing that loving God was that. It was like, oh, we got to love God first, and then kind of once we get that nailed, then we do the second one, which is love your neighbor. But that's not what he's saying. You see, the expert in the law is saying the second one is like it. He's not saying the second one is second. He's saying the second one is like it. So he's saying the second one is not second. The second one is like the first one. And what he's saying is they're codependent. In other words, loving God isn't loving God. You show me how much you love God by how much you love your neighbor. So how do you love God? Not by loving God, like, oh, I love you. It's like, no. That's, tell me how much you love your neighbor. Show me how much you love your neighbor, and I'll tell you how much you love God. And so that's the essence of the purpose of why we were created. We were created to love God. That's why we were created. But the way we love God is by loving our neighbor. That's why there's that parable where God says, what you did for the least of these, you did for me. Like, why are you coming into the kingdom? Well, because when I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was in prison, you went and visited me. When I didn't have clothes, you clothed me. Like, when did we ever see you? Like, you're God. Like, when you did it for the least of these, you did it for me. And so you're literally serving God. You're loving God, not by loving God. You're loving God by loving your neighbor. And so you have to get that, like, in your spirit, to know that that's really what you're doing. You're serving God himself, a God that doesn't need anything. How do you serve a God who doesn't need anything, who's got everything? Well, by serving him. He's like, you did it for me. That's me. So that poor person, that's God.
That's amazing.
Basically, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And in there, in Matthew 22:37, the Lord uses great examples, and one of them is that he doesn't say, hey, love your neighbor like you love your mom, or you love like yourself, because we love ourselves. Now, you went into a little bit right there earlier where you said that we love ourselves, Sure, do I love you in Christ? Absolutely, but I love myself more.
Yeah.
Can you give an example, excuse me, on that, on why it's important to see that, hey, you know what? It's not an issue of us loving ourselves. It's an issue of us showing that same love for ourselves, for our neighbor. How is that? Like, you give an example right now, the Lord's saying, when you visit me in jail, he goes, when do we do that?
Yeah.
When we did it to the least of these. How So you're saying that there's a correlation on how we love others and how we're going to love, or how we love the Lord.
Yeah.
How will we be able to see something like that, as far as like in something that we might do in our Christian walk? Like, for example, say that our brother, that we see them, he might be going through something hard.
Yeah.
Are you saying that by us showing compassion, showing love to him, we're doing the same to God, even though we're not doing it for God?
Yeah. That's how we serve God.
That's amazing.
That's how we serve him.
So there's a straight correlation there.
That's it.
That's
he's literally saying that. Yeah. Yeah. So love you God, over everything, and love your neighbor as yourself. And so and he says literally all the law and the prophets hold on these two commands. That's the purpose of life. This is why we're here, And you were saying earlier about love your neighbor as yourself. So when you say loving as you love yourself, it's like, oh man, I love myself so much. I'm so amazing. No, love means like you take care of yourself. You take care of all your needs, right? You do that. Obviously, You do. That's why you're healthy and whatever, like we take care of ourselves. He says basically, and this is like, I've never seen this played out in reality. It's almost like this glimpse of what heaven will be like, this unity, like we're part of the same thing. If you have a headache, that's my headache. I got to deal with it. Like, it's my responsibility to get you an aspirin. If you're going through financial stress, like that's my problem. I should deal with that like it was my own problem. That's the invitation. It's like, love your neighbor as yourself. It's almost an impossibility, but it's more of a North Star. Like, it's a sense of direction. Like, that's where we're headed.
That's crazy. That's amazing. So you also said one thing that I think stuck with a lot of people here, and it was you said, hey, you know what? The ocean doesn't have, it's not that the ocean has water in it, it's just the ocean is water, right?
Yeah.
So with that thought process, it's not that God gives out love, God is love, right?
Yeah.
Now, within that, there's a message, meaning that that's where we should first, are you saying that that's where we first look towards getting love? Because if God is love, and if we receive that in our hearts, then we could obviously transpond that in somebody else, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, in our walk, what would you say will be and I know you answered this in part where you're saying that there's not one thing or another, but what, if there are going to be multiple things here, but if there was one thing that you would say, I think that if we were to do this one thing right here, we'll be on the path for that. What would be that one thing? Now, and earlier you said, hey, you know what? Reading the Bible, right? Getting to know God, or coming to church every Sunday, right? Why are those things? How can those things influence us loving God?
Well, the love is the stuff of God. Like that's not, like you were saying earlier, it's not that because God has attributes and then he has essence. So his attributes are he's omniscient, he's omnipresent, like etc. But those are attributes, those are characteristics of what God is, but they're descriptions of him. They're things that he has. Like the ocean has many things. It has fish, it has algae, like it has things in it, right? But the ocean doesn't have water. The ocean is water. That's what it is. And so that's what God is. And so love is the stuff of God. The 1 John says, when you experience love, you're experiencing God. When you experience God, you're going to experience love. Like you can't, if your experience of God is not just this overwhelming experience of love, whether you're loving someone or you're receiving love, then that's not God, So it's so important that, and so how do we, like a next step, like how do we, I would say probably tweaking our prayers just a little bit. So when we pray, normally it's like, okay, I have these things that I want God to do for me. So you pray those things and you wait, right? And either he does them or he doesn't do them. I would say, let's take again, and I know I've mentioned this a bunch of times before, but taking the prayer of Gethsemane as an example, where Jesus is literally submitting his will to the will of the Father. That was his prayer. It wasn't a prayer of, like, he told God, I don't want to do it. Like, I don't want to do this, right? But then he, changes to, but your will and not my will be done. So if we tweaked our prayers to not my will, but your will be done. Like you can say, hey, I got all these things that I want you to do for me, and I feel like you're asking me to do something. I really don't want to do it. But you continue in that prayer, and then you bring it to a point where it's like, you know what? I know your will is better than mine. Help me change that. And so when you do that, then the Holy Spirit, the work of God starts to penetrate. But you have to create a space for that. He starts to penetrate, and then he starts to use you in benefit of other people. And it's always, always, always a benefit of other people. It's never about you, ever.
Wow.
It's always about others. That's why love one another. Like we're the one another people. Love one another, pray for one another. It's like always out, out, out. And when you just focus on out, you end up receiving so much more than you would have ever received if your life was focused on yourself. So that's the invitation. It's not a life of suffering. Like, oh man, I got to take care of all these people. He's like, no, you will be happier living that way. Jesus says you're going to be happier. That is the way of life that we're called to live in.
A purpose-driven life.
That's a purpose-driven
Yes.
life, which is the Rick Warren book. That's such a great book. And actually the 4 messages that I'm preaching, they're based off of 4 of the titles in that book.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, as always, next week, what's next?
So next week we're going to talk about church attendance. I know it's not one of those messages like, oh, I'm so excited, I want to be here. But if I were to say what's the most important thing, or like the most basic thing is just be in church every Sunday. Like you brush your teeth every day, like you take a shower every day, like the things that you just have like locked into your schedule. You need to be in church every Sunday morning. You need to be there. You need to be there. Like this is a story I've never heard, and I feel like I've shared this with you before in other contexts. Like, my marriage is falling apart. I don't have any money. I'm feeling really depressed. I'm really feeling really sad. Why are you feeling that way? Well, it's always because I've never heard, like, actually, it's the other way around. Like, my life is going great ever since I stopped coming to church. Now everything just fell into place. And the secret is stop coming to church and your life will be great. I never heard that before. But I do hear over and over again, people like, oh, yeah, I got to get back to church because ever since I stopped coming, then all these things seem to not be working out. And I'm like, well, take a while, I guess.
Purpose.
Yeah.
Your purpose has shifted. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Josh, thank you so much for being here this Monday.
Thank you.
Appreciate you. See you on Sunday.
Thank you.
All right.
See you guys. Bye.